Section 1 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 17. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Greg Giordano. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 17. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 1. The Park Fountain by Mrs. Elizabeth Oakes Smith, author of Sinless Child, etc. The new fountain in the center of Bowling Green, near the Battery, was opened on the 4th. It attracted great crowds of people around it through the day. When we saw it in the afternoon, it was in feeble play, the water not rising more than 2 or 3 feet above the pile of rough rocks through the center of which it springs into the air. But when the water leaps, as it will, under full head, 50 or 60 feet above the rocks, and falls on every side, covering them with a snowy foam, the effect must be at once grand and beautiful. We think, had there been a little more irregularity in the pile of rocks, giving them more of a natural wildness in appearance, the effect might have been still more pleasing. But as it is, in a hot day, with the water breaking and foaming and rushing down their sides, they present one of the most grateful objects that the eye can possibly rest upon, refreshing even as the shadow of a great rock in a weary land. The fountains of New York are in their infancy, but the day will come, and probably not many years hence, when in number and beauty they will surpass the fountains of any other city in the world. The following lines were written soon after the opening of the Park Fountain, and published in the Lady's Book. We republish them now as being equally applicable to the opening of the fountain in Bowling Green. The Park Fountain by Mrs. Elizabeth Oakes Smith, author of Sinless Child, etc. Snowy fountain, upward gushing, like a spirit birth of glee, from thy cold dark pathway rushing, thus rejoicing to be free. On my cheek thy spray is falling, rock and dell and songful bird, echoes on each other calling, in thy melody are heard. Thou dost owe thy birth, O fountain, far away by wood and dale. Silver streamlets from the mountain steal to thee in lonely vale. Still amid thy falling water, mirrored in thy crystal sheen, frolic wood-nymphs wild with laughter, lured by thee from woodland green, home of light and glory leaving, for a pathway dim and drear. Struggling, hoping, inly grieving, thou rejoicest to be here. Yet a sorrow mingleth ever with the joy that set thee free. Thou art falling, fountain, never shall thy hope be given thee. Thus through darkness, doubt, and sorrow, struggling in our pathway on, hoping brighter things tomorrow, sorrowing when the goal is won. Thus like thee do we, O fountain, half in memory of the past, look once more for bower and mountain, visions bright, too bright to last. Thus like these are upward mounting, hopes for earth too fair and bright, perished hopes the hours are counting, with a promise of delight. Yet we give them kindly greeting, till the heart itself be riven, visions fond and frail and fleeting, bathed like thee in hues of heaven. End of Section 1. Read by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida.
Section 2 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 17. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 17, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 2, The Log Driver, A Tale of the Kennebec by Lawrence Labree. It was the evening of the 3rd of July, 1828. The declining sun was casting his dying colors over the surrounding country, softening the misty atmosphere over hill and dale with a mellow and cheerful light, and tinting with purple and gold the fleecy clouds that hung in ponderous piles along the whole extent of the western horizon. High in the air the whippoorwill uttered its melancholy note, and the nighthawk, circling its airy flight overhead, seemed to tell you with its peeping voice how happy it was to dip its graceful wing in the beautiful soft twilight of summer. The lowing of herds, the tinkling of bells, the merry laugh of the peasant girl, and the lively, well-meant jest of the village youth lent a cheerfulness to the scene and imparted a quiet to the heart which the most gloomy could not entirely resist. There is something sweet and holy about sunset in the country. It enlivens and expands the heart and brings forth from their secret hiding places the deep-voiced and impassioned thoughts of the mind, giving it a calm and grateful feeling to the author of all good for the benefits and many mercies he has bestowed upon us. It is not singular that man, endowed with the supreme faculty of reason, should run through his life in riot and debauchery, oppression and warfare, trampling upon the weak, gratifying his own base desires, and seeking to monopolize all the benefits and luxuries of life, unmindful of the past, abusing the present, and giving no thought to the future, striving to believe there is time enough to talk of that when he shall become too old to enjoy existence. Vain creature, how uncertain is life! At any moment, without a warning voice, the dread conqueror, Death, who misseth no man's door, may, with his chilling breath and frosty hand, summon us away to that undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. Heed the warning, heed the warning. Let not the enemy strike, and no preparation of defense made. In the still watches of the night, dream not of security, for even then the invisible hand of the destroyer may be above thy pillow. But to our tale. The bright sun was bidding the day farewell as Norman Murray and Mary Lindsay rambled along the banks of the Kennebec at that point above the falls of Skowhegan, where a graceful bend in the river sways its smooth and swelling tide into the broad basin that nurses for a moment its dark waters ere they fling themselves in maddening riot and confusion over the dashing cataract below. Though the force of the fall is doubtless weakened by an island that rises up in the middle of the river, turning one half the stream to the right, still the height of the precipice and the body of water falling over it is such that many a fearful tale is told of fatal accidents and hair-breadth escapes. We have introduced you, indulgent reader, to two of the leading characters of our drama. Shall we leave them in silence as they actually walk for half an hour, while we describe the beauties of the Kennebec, the thunder of Skowhegan, the enterprise of the villages on either side of the river, the neat white congregational meeting house in Bloomfield, with its bright tin spire, and the gray barn-like one opposite, Baptist, if our memory serves us. Shall we tell of the merry peals of the two bells on a Sunday morning, of the smart things said some 16 years ago, when the bells were first introduced and raised to their present high station, how they may be heard of a clear day for miles, sending their echoes over the hill and over the dale, through the villages and over the water, and all through the big forests that loom up everywhere around, like great blue clouds. Shall we tell how those two bells came all the way from Boston? Perhaps, if the Clarion doesn't contradict us. Shall we tell how often, with Uncle Joel and Kate and Sophia, Aunt seldom went to meeting then, we have sat in the little white meeting house looking all around and thinking of anything but the sermon, and aching to get out and be in the river or on it in a dugout or log canoe? Shall we tell you of the hum of the grist mills, sawmills, and all other mills, of taverns and dusty countrymen, of stores where they sell in the same room liquor by the 3-cent glass, you can sweeten it with molasses, W.I. goods and groceries, English and French dry goods, done fish, smoked herring, hardware, produce, etc., etc., besides everything else that a family may want to use in a whole year. Above all, shall we tell you of the industry and integrity of the people and their prosperity, of the frugal housewives and the pretty lasses all in bloom and blossom? Shall we tell you all this while Norman and Mary are walking in silence by the murmuring water? If we should, you would all know what a delightful place it is, and how happy are the people. Happy? You would think so, if you had seen them as we have, at a general training or muster. They burn so much powder, and make such furious joy. Oh ho, says the clarion, you have been among us. Indeed we have. 14 years ago, last New Year's, we skated all day long on the Kennebec, and many a time before that, but that was the last time. We were there when the incident that forms the subject of our story occurred, hoeing corn all day long in the boiling hot sun. But we were none the better pleased for that, for we were deprived of our holiday as punishment for something we knew not of. But we were revenged, for one day, many days after that, we feigned a sick headache to escape work. We were too sick to do anything. Our head ached terribly. Well, we were offered 9 pence to pull flax all day. 9 pences were scarce. We took it. Pull flax all day in the hot sun for 9 pence, with the sick headache. Wonderful endurance. Yes, we have been among you, ladies and gentlemen of Skowhegan and Bloomfield, rambling over the hills and paddling in the river, and the memory of those times is dear to us yet, and our residence there was one of the green spots in our existence. May we some time meet again. Fare you well. We left Norman and Mary walking together in silence, but the mute converse of their hearts conveyed the eloquent thoughts of each to the other, and many a sweet thing was fancied, and many a rapturous feeling glowed in their hearts, which seemed to wall them round with an invisible paradise of bliss. They were fondly attached to each other, and as all things smiled propitious on their love, the evening of the succeeding day was appointed for their nuptials. The nearness of the long anticipated period gave to Mary a feeling of timidness, and she had thus wandered forth to enjoy the beauties of the surrounding scenery, and to inhale new life, after the sultry heat of the day, from the refreshing coolness of the twilight breeze. Mary was first to break the silence. My dear Norman, why do you not leave your arduous and toilsome occupation? Why are you still a log driver? Because I enjoy its excitement, Mary. But it is dangerous, therefore it may be for death. Because of its danger do I like it. It is a glorious life to me, so exhilarating, so full of incident, without which I could not endure it. But Norman, I do not wish to have you continue it. I like it not. I cannot bear its excitement, when I know that he whom I love better than life itself is exposed to its dangers. Dear generous girl, but why so opposed to it? Surely there is not as much danger as you apprehend. There may not be, Norman, but my fears magnify an hundredfold, and I cannot be happy while you are exposed to danger. Danger has charms for me. I love the sound of the rushing stream and the roar of the cataract. I would have such for my death knell. I love. What else does Norman love? I love you, Mary, better than all these, better than earth or air, better than my existence. Then let me entreat you to forswear this slavish toil. Slavish, we leap with the torrent. Slavish, by my right hand, it is the most perfect liberty. Well then, these hardships, privations, and severe duties, I will not say, by the love you bear me, but for my sake I beg of you to quit it. You do not follow it from necessity, wherefore then do you continue it? For your sake, Mary, I will do anything, but... Ah, now, Norman, no buts. promise me that you will have no further connection with the business. But this summer, no. This month, this 1 month, no, no. It must be now. Promise me that you will not drive another log. Mary, I cannot promise that. Look at Skowhegan. There are 500 logs that have formed a press on the pitch of the falls. They must be got off tomorrow. It is a bad job, and my companions would say I left them through fear, should I refuse them my assistance, and they shall never say that. Those logs off, sweet Mary, and I promise you it shall be my last at log driving. Why go at all? Yet you have told me. I feel that there is danger connected with yonder logs, for to me they look ominous. Norman, do not go. Mary, I have acceded to your wishes almost as you required. Be therefore generous and leave me the 1 day I crave. Be it so, Norman, but I fear that I shall have cause to rue it. I have ever had a presentiment that some ill would befall you near this place. I never look upon those dashing waters that I do not associate them with some idea of horror. Speak not so, Mary. Although I heed not presentiments and omens, yet it gives me unpleasant thoughts to hear you speak of them. Do you not think, Norman, that they are sent by the unseen power to warn us of approaching events that, if we cannot shun, we may be the better prepared to meet them with becoming fortitude? I think that what you call presentiment arises through fear, and when we form a strong attachment to any person or anything, and adopt a certain dread of any event that might occur, which would deprive us of any dear friend, or make reality of any imagined evil, those thoughts will, if suffered to linger, magnify into fears, and those fears become presentiments. This, I think, is the true anatomy of a presentiment. Do you not believe, then, that coming events cast their shadows before? I cannot. Why should they? Has there been, thus far, anything sad or sorrowful in our lives that we should anticipate evil? Alas, the less able should I be to bear it. Continual affliction strengthens the heart until it becomes hard and callous to misfortune. But I, who have scarce ever known sorrow or disappointment, should sink under the weight of blighted affection. Pray God I never meet the trial. Heaven forbid. Our hearts, Mary, have long been united. Tomorrow unites our hands. Then shall we have passed the Rubicon, whence there is no returning. Then shall have been spoken the holy rite and the solemn vow that bind us forever. Do you not, as I do, hail with joy the approaching event? Do you not think from that time we may date our real happiness? I hope so, Norman. That I hail the event with joy is true, but there is a pleasing sadness connected with it which I cannot divest myself of, yet I would not have you participate in it. Do I not love you, Mary? Have I not knelled in the deep and pathless wood for you, and by the river's side? Have I not sought your love and obtained it, your will to be mine, and it was granted? And does not tomorrow's eve unite us forever? Why then should I be sorrowful? With so much happiness before me, what cause have I for sorrow? We will live hereafter with and for one another. We will let no imaginary nor anticipated evils disturb us. It shall be my fondest and proudest endeavor to promote and ensure your happiness, and may death find us in old age after a long, happy, and useful life, ready to depart together. Think you shall never change? Ungenerous girl! Forgive me the thought. One loving less than I would fear less. Doubt you? No. Had I 1,000 times more to lay upon the cast, I would venture all for you. Oh, leave then, leave this toilsome and weary life which you follow with so much zest, and occupy your mind with something more befitting your abilities. I will, tomorrow. Tomorrow? I thank you, Norman. Yes, I thank you. I am so pleased to think of it. Tomorrow. After tomorrow I promise to devote myself to you, and now, Mary, had we not better return? The air is getting damp with the heavy dew. Mary only answered with a sigh, and clinging closer to Norman, they returned to the house of her father, about 1/4 of a mile from the falls. The morning of the 4th, that hallowed point of time in our national history, round which our fondest memories gather, was ushered in by the roar of cannon and the ringing of two aforesaid meeting-house bells. It was a bright and joyous morning. Not a cloud floated on the lazy atmosphere, and the sun arose like some mighty deity, imparting brilliancy to the scene, and lighting with a happy smile of pleasure the dark and healthful features of the peasantry. Norman arose as Aurora shed her earliest plume to join in the festivities of the day, for having so much cause of happiness himself, he could not resist the temptation to participate in the ceremonies of the celebration. As to him that day possessed a double interest, and he forbade a melancholy thought to intrude upon his mind. The early part of the day passed off as such great days usually pass off in Skowhegan, and every face wore a smile of satisfaction. About 1 o'clock, Norman, with several others, repaired to the falls to clear off the logs that had lodged on the rocks above. On that side of the precipice nearest the island, several rocks projected above the surface of the water, and against these a large log had lodged crosswise, which caught others as they descended to the fall, thus forming a press of some 100 logs. And when Norman and his companions arrived at the spot, they questioned each other as to the best method of dislodging them. It was finally settled that the quickest and best way to accomplish their object would be to cut the foremost log until the pressure of those above should break it, when the entire mass would sway round and pass over without further difficulty. But this was a hazardous task, and who would undertake it? Who of the party was bold enough to venture, and standing on the brow of the precipice, facing the abyss below, to commence the task of cutting the huge timber? It could be done. All that was required was judgment and quickness, for one leap would put the person safe on shore. After a few moments' debate, a young man, bold and reckless, jumped upon the foremost log and commenced cutting. He soon came off, however, declaring that for all the logs that ever floated down the Kennebec, I will not raise my axe again. "You are a coward, Amesford. Give me the axe," exclaimed Norman. "I will cut the log, for it is my last job of the kind, and I wish to finish it like a man." "No, no, Norman, be not rash," shouted one of the party. "My life upon it, there is danger in the attempt." "And mine upon it too," cried Norman. "Danger I never yet did shun," and with a light step he sprang upon the log. "Norman, Murray, be cautious, man. Let this rope be tied round you." "No ropes for me," he shouted. Come back, the log will break in a moment without more cutting. See, it bends even now. Norman." But he heard them not, or if he did, he heeded not. He had reached the center and stood with his face toward the fatal chasm, which boiled below like a mighty cauldron. A smile of pride was on his face. He cast a look of triumph upon the shore, thronged with people who came to witness the success of the log drivers. He raised his axe, struck once, twice, thrice. There it stuck. The log cracked. It trembled for an instant like a thing affrighted, and then, as the multitude around stood breathless, came a crash and one piercing cry of agony, and Norman Murray fell forward into the foaming waters below. Then an exclamation of horror burst from his comrades, and instantly a rush was made to the scene of the disaster, while the logs came tumbling and pitching down. All stood aghast, for no human arm could yield him succor. For an instant he was lost amid the whirling mass, but on a sudden a cry of joy burst from the crowd around, for their eager eyes beheld him rise through the foam and strike out toward the shore. He approached so near that his right hand was laid upon the flat surface of a rock. He is safe, cried an 100 voices. No, for just then a large log, like a malicious and evil monster, came gambolling and rolling along, and struck Norman in the head, sending him with much force back again into the whirling current. The multitude now rushed to the other side of the bridge and to the shores below it. Again he was seen to come to the surface, but nearly exhausted, and his efforts to swim were very feeble. The river at that place being deep and the current strong, he was carried into a whirlpool a short distance below the bridge, from which he was unable to extricate himself, and in a few seconds he sunk, to rise with life no more. Thus terminated the existence of Norman Murray, a young man beloved by all who knew him, and who promised fair to become a useful member of society. As he was seen to sink, a groan of woe burst from the assembled spectators, and with downcast faces and mournful looks they left the spot to communicate the sad event to their friends. But there was one destined too soon to listen to the awful tale. The wedding of Norman and Mary was to have taken place at the house of an uncle of the bride's, who resided about 3 miles from her father's. For that purpose, in the early part of the day, Mr. Lindsay, with his wife and daughter, she was an only child, departed for the residence of his brother, where considerable preparation was making for the ceremony, and where, as soon as his business was ended, Norman was to join them. News of disaster is apt to travel fast, but the public mind being then so occupied with the exciting festivities of the 4th, together with the absence of Mr. Lindsay's family, prevented any immediate communication to them of the fatal event at the falls. Thus at length the day faded into twilight, and the bride, her father, and her mother wondered at the absence of Norman. Patiently they sat in their neat little parlor, while the evening breeze sighed murmuringly through the open lattice, and the cricket chirped beneath the hearthstone. Mary was pale, and her innocent heart fluttered with strange emotions. A voiceless feeling of suspense, the first bud of doubt, which she would not acknowledge to be doubt, an upbraiding thought which her delicate love used all arguments to overcome, an apprehensive fear which hope, the angel, murmured against, touched at times her trembling nerves, sweeping over them like sad music over the strings of a lute. A tear, like sparkling dew, moistened her fringed eyelids, and she heeded few words that were spoken, so rapt seemed she in the deep mysteries of her own heart. Moment after moment passed away. The minister had arrived, but the bridegroom, Norman, was still absent. Wonder grew into conjecture, conjecture into alarm. Mr. Lindsay sought some excuse for his absence in the excitement of the day, and yet he had never known him break his word before. Mary sat at the window with her eyes fixed upon the road up which Norman must pass to reach the house, and almost held her breath to catch the slightest sound that might herald his approach. Unwitting doe, she could neither see nor turn aside fate's unerring shaft. Poor Norman, calm wert thou in thy deep sleep beneath the cold dark water. Oh, how willingly wouldst thou have met thy bride that evening! With what a beaming eye and joyful heart wouldst thou have clasped her to thy bosom! But alas, such bliss was not for thee. Little didst thou ever dream that thy nuptial couch would be the cozy bed of the river. Weep for the heart that must be broken. Weep for poor Mary Lindsay, as she sat watching every person that approached, listening to every falling footstep until her heart grew chill and her cheek pale. Alone she could have wept like a child, but there the tears fell silently, and the burden of her grief was stifled in her bosom. One horrid thought clung to her, the falls, the logs. Yet another hour passed away, bringing no Norman, and Mary now groaned aloud in her agony. Mary, my poor girl, said her father, reason with your grief. Norman is a true lad, and would not play you false. Some unavoidable delay must detain him. He may have deferred driving the logs over until sunset, or they may have given him trouble. They may have given him trouble, father, she answered with a meaning and startled voice. The logs, merciful heaven! My dear child, said Mrs. Lindsay, do not needlessly alarm yourself. Norman will soon arrive, and will be able to explain the cause of his delay. Oh, mother, she cried, I cannot help it. There is a fate awaits me which I cannot shun. There is a load at my heart, a grief I cannot speak. Whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth, exclaimed the minister. In the midst of life we are in death. Death? Did you speak of death? Alas, poor Norman, shall I never see you again? Hark, hark, he comes, he comes. Did I not say he would come? Look there, look. As fast as horse can bring him, dear mother, I shall be happy. I am happy now. All listened. They could distinctly hear the sound of a horse's hoofs coming at full speed up the road toward the house. Mr. Lindsay and his wife went to the door. Mary moved not from where she sat, having resolved, as a slight punishment for the distress Norman had caused her, not to meet him as he entered. The horseman rode up to the house, dismounted, and advanced to the door, in which stood Mr. Lindsay. He at first seemed embarrassed with the burden of some difficult message that appeared to puzzle him how he should best deliver it. Mr. Lindsay perceived his embarrassment, and a vague suspicion crossed his mind that the man came the bearer of unpleasant tidings. He was, therefore, the first to break the silence. "How is this, Amherst?" asked Lindsay. "You come to me a dumb messenger? If you have ill news for us, out with it, man. Surely nothing pleasant to hear would be so slow in coming." "I would not willingly be a bearer of ill tidings. Mine is an unpleasant task. Mrs. Lindsay, take courage and draw largely upon your strength of reason. I am indeed the messenger of most woeful news." "I can conceive it all," said Mrs. Lindsay. "Some misfortune to Norman, is it not? Speak softly." "It is," replied Amherst, "but it will fall heavier upon others than upon Norman. They have yet to suffer, long suffering. Norman's is—" "Over, you would say, Amherst?" exclaimed Mr. Lindsay. "You have no doubt come to tell us that Norman is dead." A shriek, one heartbroken shriek, and the lifeless form of Mary fell upon the hall floor behind them. In suspense at the conversation between her parents and Amherst, she had stolen cautiously behind them, where she heard those fatal words, "Norman is dead." They broke her heart, poor girl. "Oh, my daughter, cried Mrs. Lindsay. "Mary, my dear broken-hearted girl, look up, or you will kill your poor mother." And she knelt on the floor beside her and pressed her death-pale cheek to her bosom and kissed her sweet lips. Means were quickly resorted to for her resuscitation, and anxiety and grief were pictured on every face. For several moments no signs of animation appeared, and the sterner eyes around were wet with tears like women's at the piteous sight they gazed upon. Tears from all but the father. He stood over the prostrate form of his child, speechless and tearless, for this calamity had left him without word or motion. When Mary at last opened her eyes, she looked eagerly upon the faces of those around her, and then clinging closer to her mother, she exclaimed, "Hist, Norman, are we not wedded? They said that you were dead, but I would not believe them. I knew better than that." "I am not Norman, dear child," exclaimed Mrs. Lindsay. "I am your mother. Do you not know me?" "Not Norman? No. But you are not my mother. My mother, why, she has been dead this many a year, and I am a poor, lonely, miserable orphan, without parents or friends, no home to shelter me from the cruel storms. Oh, I am freezing, but there is a furnace in my head, burning there. Norman, dear Norman, hark! I heard him call me. Did you not?" She arose from the floor. "Again, did you not hear him call me? Then let me go to him. Will you not? But I will, though. Norman, only speak to me, and I will fly to you. Ha! See! He stands upon the falls, with the crazy, dashing waters leaping all around, and the big logs striving to fall upon him. Now he waves his hand for aid. Will you not save him? See, he trembles, he falls. Lost forever, lost." Here she again fell senseless into the arms of her father. Then broke forth the fountains of his grief, and he raised his eyes toward heaven, exclaiming, "O God, have mercy, for surely this day hast thou stricken us with a grievous affliction." Mary remained insensible for nearly half an hour, but when life again appeared and speech returned, she continued wandering in mind, wild and feverish. At times she imagined herself married, then for a few moments she would seem happy. Again she appeared to have some faint idea of her true situation. Then her moanings were piteous to hear. Thus passed she the night. Nothing that could be done for her seemed in the least to give her quiet. In the morning a brain fever had set in, and a physician was sent for. He exercised all his skill. He tried his best remedies. Nothing seemed of any avail. She hourly grew worse, and ere the sun of that day went to rest, her gentle spirit, like Noah's dove, went out from its ark a third time, never to return. It found a heaven to rest its weary wing in, and sweet communion with blessed and kindred spirits. She left a heritage of woe for her parents, grief and its cankerworm, for their hearts were left to mourn and wither over the memory of their lost daughter, and they were taught to look upward and to fasten their hopes upon the perfect state of bliss in which only they might expect ever again to meet their lamented child. She was laid beneath the green turf of the village churchyard, and over her grave the early sweet spring flowers blossom, and on summer days fair maidens like herself bring garlands of bright roses to stew upon her lowly resting place. Birds warble their tinkling music around, and in moonlight nights, when the glittering stars peep out upon the sleeping earth, the pure dew of heaven falls softly over her. A few days after the death of Mary, the body of Norman was found about 3 miles below Skowhegan and conveyed back to the village and interred by the side of his Mary. Peace to their manes. End of section 2. Recording by Brize, Cries, Youngstown, Ohio, July 5th, 2021.
Section 3 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 17. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 17, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 3, The Serenade, by the late Lucy Hooper, with an engraving. Oh, wake thee, lady, wake, for the stars are on the sea, and their holy torches burn, but for thee, love, for thee. Oh, wake thee, lady, wake, for the dew is on the flowers, and the quiet, quiet night must be ours, only ours. Oh, wake thee, lady, wake, in the day's sweet prime, other voices whisper thee, winning tones from thine. But at night, wake for me, when the holy stars are bright on the sleeping sea. Like the birds in twilight bower, I must sing to thee. Lady love and cherished flower, keep thy tryst with me. Softly now the moon is beaming as I come to thee, and the jasmine stars are gleaming. Wake thee, love, for me. As a holy torch that shineth, though no eye may see, as the sun that ne'er declineth, is my love for thee. Then wake thee, lady, wake, while the burning stars are bright, and I will whisper thee my dream of yesternight. That the moon was on the sea, and the dew was on the flower, when thou didst leave with me thy pleasant summer bower. Oh, wake thee, lady mine, and keep thy tryst tonight, for the moon is on the sea, and the holy stars are bright. End of section 3. Recording by Alan Mapstone.
Section 4 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 17. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by J. Salem. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 17, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section number 4. Two Scenes from the Civil War by G.P.R. James. It was late, on the night of an early day in spring, perhaps 2 hours past midnight, and yet the inhabitants of a small lonely dwelling on the edge of a piece of common ground, lying about 10 miles from Farringdon House, were all awake and up, and with anxious eyes gazing from the small long windows upon the blank darkness that hung over the world. A single candle stood upon a plain oaken table in the midst of the room, by the light of which might be seen, at one of the windows, a small, finely formed female figure, which still preserved, all the lines of exquisite beauty, though a certain degree of stiffness, corresponding well with some deep wrinkles on the cheek, and the white hair that was braided from the forehead, spoke the passing of many years under the petrifying power of time since that form had been in its prime, and that beauty, which still lingered, had known its first expansion. Leaning over her shoulder was another figure, so like the first, but with every grace which time had nipped in it just blown, with the cheek unwithered and the brow unseared, that it seemed a living picture of what the other had been some 20 years before. A portrait in a family picture gallery, where human loveliness may see and moralize on all the graces that the eternal Reaper has gathered as he flew. At the second window was a somewhat untidy maidservant, contrasting strongly in her slatternly disarray with the plain neatness which decked the two figures, whose garb I shall not pause to describe. Let it suffice that it was of white, and fashioned in the mode of the time, A.D. 1640-something, though either poverty, simplicity of taste, or deference to the puritanical mania of the day had deprived it of every extraneous ornament. The night upon which the whole party looked out was dark and sad, for the moon had gone down, and the clouds overhead, though not particularly heavy, were quite sufficient to hide every star and cast a deep gray shadow over the wide extent of undulated moorland, which stretched away for many a mile within the view in the daytime. A few faint streaks of pale light upon the sky separated the darkness of the heavens from the darkness of the earth, and marked where the prospect ended. And thitherward were turned the eyes of all, watching, with straining and anxious gaze, a particular point on the dim horizon where every now and then bright red flashes, sudden and sharp, but circumscribed and momentary, broke the night, followed by a distant report, as quick and transitory. No one spoke while those flashes continued, but the silence itself seemed to show the intense anxiety which was felt by the tenants of that chamber in regard to the events of which they obtained so dim and unsatisfactory a view. At the end of 5 minutes, however, the sudden bursts of light entirely ceased. The reports were no longer heard, and the elder of the two ladies, turning away from the window, said in a low voice, "It's over. God's will is wrought by this time." The younger said nothing, but clasping her fair hands together, raised her eyes toward the dark heavens, while her full sweet lips moved silently, offering up a petition to that never-closed ear which hears the still voice of the heart's thoughts as plainly as the loudest-tongued appeal. In a moment after, the clattering sound of horses' feet was heard coming quickly down the road. At first it was faint and distant, the heavy tramp of several fleet steeds galloping over moist ground. But soon it came nearer and nearer, left the turf of the common, clanged over the firm and stony ground, came close to the house, passed it, and died away in the distance. "They are flying," said the younger lady. "Oh, my mother, they are flying. Surely some of the dark powers of the air must assist those bloodthirsty fanatics. They are flying. Do you not hear the horses galloping on?" "Nay, nay, Margaret," replied the other. "It may be the Roundheads who fly. Though Goring and his cavaliers march by here, we cannot tell what way the struggle may have turned, or on what side he attacked the rebels. So it may well be the traitors that fly themselves. But look out, look out! Your eyes are younger than mine, less dimmed with tears. Perchance you may catch a passing glimpse that will give us glad news." The younger lady pressed her eyes close to the window, and though by this time the first party of fugitives had passed the house, yet the distant sound of others coming nigh met her ear, and she continued to gaze upon the faint line of the road to the spot where the yellow glare of the gravel, which distinguished it from the ground about it, was lost in the general darkness of the common. At length 3 dark figures came forward with tremendous speed. At first, so near together and so hidden by the night that she could hardly distinguish them from each other. But gradually the forms became more and more clear, and as they darted past the house, she exclaimed in a glad tone, "They are the rebels! They are rebels flying for life! I see their great boots and their morions without crest or plumes." "But they may be pursuing those who went before," said her mother, with a less elated tone. "They may be the followers, and not the flyers, Margaret." "No, no, they are flying in good sooth," replied the young lady, "for ever and anon they turn their heads to look behind, and urge their horses faster to each look. But they are gone, and now pray God that victory may not cost us dear. I would that my brother were came back, and Henry Lyle." "Fie, Margaret, fie," said her mother. "Give God undivided thanks, for if my son and your lover be both left upon the field of battle, we ought still to feel that their lives were well bestowed to win a victory for their royal master." Margaret covered her eyes with her hands, but made no answer, and in a moment after, fresh coming sounds called her again to the window. It was a single horseman who now approached, and though he rode at full speed, with his head somewhat bent over the saddle, he yet continued his course steadily, and neither turned to look to the right or left. As he approached the house, his horse started suddenly from some object left by the roadside, plunged and fell, and was thrown on his head upon the ground. A deep groan was at first the only sound, but the moment after, the horse which had borne him, starting up, approached close to the body of its master, and, putting its head where he lay, by a long while neigh, seemed at once to express its sorrow and to claim assistance. "If it be Essex or Manchester, Fairfax or Cromwell, we must render him aid, Margaret," said the mother. "Never must it be said that a friend or enemy needed help at my door and did not meet it. Call up the Hines boy, Bridget. Open the door, and bring in yon fallen man." Her commands were speedily fulfilled, for, though brought low in her estate, the Lady Heiress was not one to suffer herself to be disobeyed. The stranger was lifted from the ground, placed in a chair, and carried into the house. His eyes were closed, and it was evident to the elder lady, as she held the candle to his face, that if not killed, he was completely stunned by his fall. He was a hard-featured man, with short grizzled hair, and a heavy, determined brow, on which the lines of habitual thought remained, even in the state of stupor into which he had fallen. He was broadly made and muscular, though not corpulent, and was above the middle size without being tall. His dress consisted of a dark gray coat, which clove to him with the familiar ease of an old servant, and a brown cloak, which in truth had lost much of its freshness in his service. Above his coat had been placed a complete cuirass, the adjustment of which betrayed great symptoms of haste, and by his side he wore one of those long heavy blades of plain steel which had often been the jest of the cavaliers. His head was uncovered either by hat or morion, and the expanse of his forehead, the only redeeming point in his countenance, was thus fully displayed. The rest of his face was not only coarse in itself, but had its expression. And when, after some cold water had been thrown over it, he revived in a degree and looked around, the large, shrewd, unsatisfactory eyes which he turned upon those about him had nothing in them to prepossess the mind in his favor. The moment that consciousness had fully returned, he made an effort to start upon his feet, but instantly sunk back again into the chair, exclaiming, "The Lord had smitten me, yet I must gird up my loins and go, lest I fall into captivity." Fear not," replied the Lady Herrick, whose humanity was somewhat chivalrous. "You are in safety here. Wait for a while, till you are better able to mount, and then get you gone in God's name, for I seek not to foster Roundheads more than may be. Yet stay till you can ride," she added, seeing his hand again grasp the chair as if to rise. "Woman should know no enemies in the hurt and wounded." "Nay, but, worthy lady," replied the parliamentarian, "should the crew of the Moabitish General Goring follow me even here to smite me hip and thigh, as they have vowed to do to all who bear arms for godliness' sake, or to bear me away captive?" "Fear not," answered the lady. "None should dare, by my hearth side, to lay hands on one that common mercy bade me to take in and shelter. Fear not, I say." "That is right, Margaret," she added, seeing her daughter pour some wine into a glass for the use of the stranger. "Take that, it will revive you, and give you strength to speed on." "Hast thou caught the stranger's horse, Dixon?" she demanded, turning to the boy who had aided in bringing in the Commonwealth man, and who now re-entered the room after a momentary absence. "He is caught and made fast below," replied the lad, "and here are my young master and Master Henry Lyle coming up from the court. They have beaten the Roundheads and killed Colonel Cromwell and taken his whole army prisoners." Scarcely had he time to pour forth this rapid tide of news, when the door was thrown open and two young cavaliers in broad hats and plumes followed one another rapidly in, each taking with the lips of the two ladies that dear liberty consecrated to intimacy and affection. "Welcome, welcome, my gallant son," cried the mother, as she held the first to her bosom. "My own dear Margaret," whispered the young gentleman who had followed, as he took the unresisting kiss which welcomed him back from danger and strife. But further congratulations of all kinds were suddenly stopped, as the eyes of the two cavaliers fell upon the stranger, who had now recovered strength to rise from his seat, and was anxiously looking toward the door beyond them. "Who the devil's name have we here?" cried Sir George Herrick. "What crop-eared villain is this?" In vain his mother explained, and strove to pacify him. The sight of one of the rebels raised again in his bosom all the agitating fury of the fight in which he had been just engaged, and neither the prayers of his mother or his sister, the promise they had made the stranger, or their remonstrances to himself, had any effect. "Ho, boy!" he exclaimed, "bid your father bring a rope. By the Lord of heaven, I will hang this Roundhead cur to the oak before the door. Bring a rope, I say." And unsheathing his sword, he advanced on the parliamentarian, calling upon his companion to prevent his escape by the door. The stranger said not a word, but bit his nether lip, and calmly drawing his tuck, retreated into one corner of the room, keeping a fixed eye upon the young cavalier who strode on toward him. Margaret, seeing that all persuasion was vain with her brother, turned her imploring eyes to Henry Lyle, who instantly laid his hand upon his companion's cloak. "What now?" exclaimed the other, turning sharp upon him. "This must not be, George," replied the other cavalier. "Must not be?" thundered Sir George Herrick. "But it shall be. Who shall stay me?" Your own better reason and honor, I trust, replied the other. Hear me, but hear me, Herrick. Your lady mother promised this fellow safety to stay and to go. And upon her promise alone, she says, he stayed. Had that promise not been given, we should not have found him here. Will you slay a man by your own hearth who put confidence in your mother's word? Fie, fie, let him go. We have slain enough this night to let one rebel escape, were he the devil himself. Sir George Herrick glared around for a moment in moody silence and then put up his sword. Well, he said at length, if he stayed but on her promise, let him take himself away. He will grace the gibbet some other day. But do not let me see him move across the room, he added with a look of disgust, or I shall run my blade through him whether I will or not. Come, fellow, get thee gone, said Henry Lyle. I will see thee depart. And while his companion fixed his eyes with stern intensity upon the fireplace, as if not to witness the escape of the Roundhead, he led him out of the chamber to the outer door. The stranger moved forward with a firm, calm step, keeping his naked sword still in his hand, and making no comment on the scene in which he had been so principal a performer. As he passed through the room, however, he kept a wary eye on Sir George Herrick, but the moment he quitted it, he seemed more at ease and paused at the door while the boy brought forward his charger. During that pause, he turned no unfriendly look upon Henry Lyle, and seemed as if about to speak more than once. At length he said in a low voice, Something I would fain say, though God knows we are poor blinded creatures, and see not what is best for us, of thanks concerning that carnal safety, which it may be doubted whether— No thanks are needed, interrupted Henry Lyle, cutting across what promised to be one of the long harangues habitual with the fanatics of that day. No thanks are needed for the safety that is grudgingly awarded. I tell thee plainly that had it not been for the lady's promise, I would willingly have aided in hanging thee with my own hands. And when next we two meet face to face, we shall not part till the lifeblood of one or the other mark our meeting place. It may be so, if such be God's will, replied the parliamentarian. And now I pray the Lord to give me strength, that I may never be found slack to do the work appointed me. Thou hast never been so yet, though it be the work of the evil one, answered Henry Lyle, and then added, I know thee, though none else here does, or it had fared harder with thee in despite of all the promises. Thou knowest me, said the stranger without testifying any great surprise. Then thou dost the better deed in Israel, and I will trust, notwithstanding thy present malignancy, that the day of grace may yet come to thee. Farewell. Thus saying, he put his foot in the stirrup, and mounting somewhat heavily, the horse which was now brought up for him, rode away across the common. Time flew. Years passed. The temporary success obtained by General Goring over the forces of Oliver Cromwell was swept away and forgotten in a tide of brilliant triumphs won by the parliamentary general, who trod upon the steps of victory to the government of an empire. He had conquered his opponents by the sword. He had conquered his partisans by hypocrisy. He had subdued all to his will, and, under the name of Lord General, ruled with more power than a king. In the meanwhile, Sir George Herrick and Henry Lyle had fought to the last in the cause of their ancient monarchs, and their zeal, like that noblest of human energies, hope, had grown but the stronger under the pressure of misfortune and distress. Amongst the various chances of the Civil War, 5 times had the day been appointed for the union of Henry Lisle with Margaret Herrick, and 5 times had some unforeseen mishap intervened to delay what all so much desired. Each day that went by, Lady Herrick, with means quite exhausted and hopes quite depressed, longed more and more to see her child united to a man of talent and firmness and resource. And each battle that passed by, Sir George Herrick, struck with a presentiment of approaching fate, thanked God that he had lived to place his sister's hand in that of his friend. The last time the marriage was suspended was on the fatal call to Worcester Field, where Sir George Herrick fell, and Henry Lisle only escaped to bear his companion's last request to Margaret, that without further pause or delay, without vain ceremonies or useless tears, she would give herself at once to her promised protector. Their wedding was a sad one. No glad peal, no laughing crane announced the union of the two lovers. And ere the day of their bridal was spent, Henry Lisle was a prisoner, journeying toward the Tower of London. His trial was delayed some time, but when it took place it was soon decided. No evidence was wanting to his full conviction of loyalty to his king, and the block and axe was the doom pronounced upon him. A brief 3 days lay between him and death, and Margaret, who was permitted to see him, clung in agony to her husband's bosom. Lady Herrick, to whom he had been more than a son, gazed for some time with equal agony upon his fine but faded countenance, which, worn by toil and anxiety and long imprisonment, was still more clouded by the hopeless despair of her he loved. But suddenly, without a word, the mother turned away and left the prison. It was in that great and unequaled hall, whose magnificent vault has overhung so many strange and mighty scenes in English history, and whose record of brief and gorgeous pageants reads as a sad homily on the human littleness, even as the dark memorials of the tomb. It was in Westminster Hall, on the 16th day of December, that with the clangor of trumpets and all the pomp and splendor of both military and civil state, a splendid procession moved forward to a chair or throne, raised on some ornamental steps at the farther extremity of the building. Judges, in those solemn robes intended to give dignity to the judgments they pronounce, and officers, dressed in all that glittering panoply destined to deck and hide the rugged form of war, moved over the echoing pavement between 2 long ranks of soldiers who kept the space clear from the gazing and admiring multitude. But the principal figure of the whole procession, on which all eyes were turned, was that of a stout, broad-built man, with a dingy, weather-beaten countenance, shaggy eyebrows, and a large red nose. His countenance was as unprepossessing as can be conceived, nor was his dress, which consisted of plain black velvet, at all equal to those which surrounded him. But there was something in his carriage and his glance not to be mistaken. It was the confidence of power, not the extraneous power of circumstance and situation, but that of concentrated internal strength, which guides and rules the thing around it. Each step, as he planted it upon the pavement, seemed destined to be rooted there forever, and his eye, as it encountered the glances of those around, fell upon them with a calm power which beat them to the dust before its gaze. Passing onward through the hall, he ascended the steps which raised the chair of state, and turning around, stood uncovered before the people. The 2 keepers of the Great Seal, standing on his right and left, read a long paper called the Institute of Government, by which, among other things, the Lord General, Oliver Cromwell was named Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England. The paper was then signed, and oath was administered, and putting on his hat, the figure which had advanced to the chair sat down amidst the acclamations of the people, while all the rest continued to stand around uncovered. Various other ceremonies were performed, and then the great usurper, rising from his seat, led back the procession toward the door of the hall. But scarcely had he traversed one half of its extent, when a woman who had been whispering to one of the soldiers who lined the way, pushed suddenly past and cast herself at Cromwell's feet. "An act of grace, Lord Protector," she exclaimed, "an act of grace to bring a much-needed blessing on the power you have assumed." "What wouldest thou, woman?" demanded Cromwell. "Somewhere I have seen thy face before." "What wouldest thou? If thy petition be conceived in godliness, and such as may be granted with safety to those poor disturbed realms, it shall not be refused on such a day as this." "When Colonel Cromwell failed in his attack on Farringdon House," said Lady Herrick, for it was she who knelt before him, "and when General Goring surprised and cut to pieces his troops at night near Warnham Common." Cromwell's brow darkened, but still she went on. "He fled from a disaster he could not prevent, and was cast from his horse, stunned at the door of a widow woman who gave him shelter. He was the enemy of her and hers, and flying from a battle in which her own son had fought, and yet she gave him rest and comfort, and opposed that very son who would have shed his blood by her hearth. There, too, Henry Lisle interposed to save his life, and was successful. Otherwise, Lord Protector, I tell thee thou wouldst never have sat in that seat which thou hast taken this day. Condemned by your judges for acting according to his conscience, I now ask for the life of Henry Lisle in return for the life he saved. Grant it, oh, grant it, as you are a man and a Christian." Cromwell's brow was dark as thunder, and after gazing on her for a moment, in silence, his only reply was, "Take her away. The woman is mad. Take her away, and put her forth, but gently, gently. Bruise not the bruised. So, now let us pass on, for in truth we have been delayed too long." Put out of the hall by the soldiers, her last hope gone, her heart nearly broken for her child and her child's husband, Lady Herrick wandered slowly on toward that sad place where she had left all that was dear to her. The gay and mighty cavalcade which conveyed the usurper back to his palace passed by her like one of those painful dreams which mock us with sights of splendor in the midst of some heavy woe. And before she had threaded many more of the solitary street, robbed of their population by the attractive ceremony of the day, a single trooper galloped up, gazed on her for a moment, and rode on. At the tower, no formalities were opposed to her immediate entrance of the prisoner's chamber. She was led to it at once. The door itself was open. An unsealed paper lay upon the table. Henry held Margaret in his arms, and tears, which she never before had seen in his eyes, now rolled plentifully down his cheeks and mingled with those of his bride. But strange to say, smiles were shining through those tears, and happiness, like the rainbow sun, beamed through the drops of sorrow. "Joy, mother, joy," were the first and only words. "Joy, mother, joy! Henry is pardoned." End of section 4.
Section 5 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 17. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Greg Giordano. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 17. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 5. The Glass Lookers by J. R. Orton. Near the waters of the Unadilla, in the state of New York, there lived, some years since, a lean shoemaker and his sturdy, well-to-do wife. No lousy cobbler was Samuel Fish, and no slatternly, good-for-nothing body was Ruth. But somehow or other, mouths increased upon them faster than they could well fill them. Their heap of children, as Aunt Eunice said, was dreadful. And indeed, the good man and his family, all told, numbered 12 to spare. And could they have been seen marching in a row from a very respectable front, made up of himself and wife, they would have run down nearly to a point. No wonder, though he industriously plied the awl and made the waxed ends glisten and twang, morning, noon, and night, while she, with equal ardor, made music with her constant step around him. That anxious care with them was a frequent guest, and want, with difficulty, barred the door. In this dilemma, the good woman took it upon her, one night, to dream a dream, and awoke therefrom in a very agreeable frame of mind. Her first impulse was to arouse her husband, who was sleeping like a log at her side, but she bethought herself that he had had a hard day's work, and after all it was but a dream, and so with commendable self-control she again composed herself to rest. Half an hour after, she awoke in a state of joyous trepidation, which would admit of no further delay. The self-same dream, complete in all its parts, had presented itself to her fancy again, giving an importance to the subject matter thereof, not to be attached to the ordinary vagaries of the night. She shook Samuel by the shoulders, and proceeded to recount it to him. She had dreamed that a little old man, in a tarpaulin hat and sugar-paper small clothes, stood before her, and, after complimenting her and her husband as very worthy, well-disposed people, if they only had the wherewithal to live, proceeded to inform her that near at hand, under a certain tree on the banks of the Unadilla, was buried a rich treasure, which might be theirs for the taking, and would do them and their little ones much good. "'Twas the ghost of Captain Kidd," said Samuel. "Oh, no, not a ghost," said Ruth, starting. "Well, well, ghost or no ghost," said Samuel, "it is a singular dream, a very singular dream, an extraordinary dream. Twice you have dreamed it, Ruth?" "Twice." "Well, good Ruth, go to sleep again, and remember, if you dream it over the third time, it will come true a certainty. Go to sleep, go to sleep." In obedience to the wishes of her spouse, the dame composed herself on her pillow, and Samuel, after fidgeting an hour or more in uneasy expectancy, becoming too nervous for repose, carefully got up and lighted a candle. With it in his hand, his face flushed with hopes new and exciting, he approached the bed and leaned over to see if he could get any clue to the success of his wife. In the expression of her features, she, good woman, with a start of terror, opened her eyes and met his inquiring gaze. The candle fell from his hand, and she bounded out of bed to extinguish it, and as she did so exclaimed, "Why, Samuel, what on earth is the matter? Are you going to burn me up alive?" "What luck? What luck?" shouted Samuel. "Dear me," returned his spouse, "I have not been asleep." Crestfallen and discomfited, the shoemaker crawled back into bed, and there he lay quietly until daylight, but he lay awake. Whether his wife slept he knew not, and though he would have given half the contents of his shop to know, he dared not disturb her. At length, as gray morning had fairly got over the hills, He was electrified by a sudden spring on her part, as she came bolt upright in bed, exclaiming, "I have it, Samuel! I have dreamed it again!" "The Lord be thanked!" said Samuel. "And now, wife, dress thee, and speed the breakfast, while I myself will attend to the children, and then we will go and consult Shaker Brown respecting this most singular visitation." Shaker Brown was a tall, venerable man of near 60, who lived hard by. His long locks were faded nearly to a white, but his limbs retained a goodly portion of their vigor, and his pure, clear, blue eye was still delightful to look upon. He had passed most of his life as one of a community of Shakers; indeed, for many years had been the principal of one of the most respectable societies of that singular sect, whence, having emerged and taken to him a young wife, in his old age, a child to the world, but deeply imbued with a knowledge of hidden things and a love for the mystical, he is peculiarly qualified to act as counselor on an occasion like the present. Hither went Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Fish for advice, and the result of their visit was satisfactory in a high degree. Shaker Brown recommended that Joe Schmidt, an itinerant vagabond glass-looker, who has since made quite a figure in the world, and was then in that region, but few miles away, should be sent for, to take the command of the important affair in hand, and for him a messenger was accordingly dispatched. Joe Schmidt, at that time, a sturdy, ruddy, square-built young fellow, in manner halfway between a clown and a sheep-thief, had already begun to lord it in a small way in matters mysterious and occult. When he arrived, he listened very respectfully to the narration of Dame Fish, but did not condescend to ask any questions, or to gape or wonder over her dream, but treated the subject in all respects as though it were a matter of course, that coffers of gold should be buried, that she should dream about them, and he be called upon to bring them again to the light of day. He told some marvelous stories of his success in this way, and finally, having secured to himself a certain compensation to be paid in hand by Samuel and Shaker Brown, beside an equal share in the venture, he proceeded to arrange a plan of operations for disemboweling the particular treasure which the little tarpaulin man had mentioned to Ruth in her dream. He exhibited a flat, opaque glass, or stone, about the size of his palm, which, he said, was found in the grave of an Indian magician, lying upon the bones of the skeleton, over the heart, and which possessed the property of revealing to him the hidden things of earth. Armed with this invaluable talisman, the dusk of evening was scarcely suffered to approach, when Samuel, Shaker Brown, and Schmidt sallied forth. The tree, a spreading beech, indicated in Ruth's dreams, was easily found, for there was a bridge across the Unadilla near by it, hid by an intervening clump of alders, and indeed both Samuel and his wife had been to the very spot 100 times, hunting for their cow, or their pigs, or their children, and knew the tree as well as they did the butternut close by their own door. Arrived thereat, Schmidt very gravely put the magical glass into his hat, and that to his face, in such a manner as to shut out all the light, while Samuel and Brown placed themselves on either side of him, and awaited in a very trying suspense his expected revelations. Soon Joe brought down the hat, and with an exclamation of delight informed them that he had discovered the box of gold, buried but a few feet beneath the surface of the ground, but that it was enchanted, and he should have to break the spell which held it there before it could be got at. Satisfied with this, as a precursor, the party returned to Samuel's house, where Ruth and Mrs. Brown anxiously awaited them, and there Schmidt showed a strong inclination to remain for the night, but the ardor of the others was too much aroused to permit of inactivity. They insisted, with much show of reason, that a delay of even one night was full of danger, and that the only safe course was to make sure of the treasure while it was within their reach. Joe was obliged to give way, and as soon as the necessary shovels and other implements could be got together, the party, enlarged by the addition of Ruth and Mrs. Brown, returned to the spot, where, by this time, many hopes and fears had become centered. Joe now disposed himself to play his part with effect. Assuming all the dignity of bearing which he could command, he proceeded to describe a circle around the tree, and stepping within it, he pronounced some cabalistic words, or words at least of unknown sound and import to his auditors. Having, by this ceremony, taken possession of the ground, as he termed it, he charged his associates that, while the work was in progress, they must not, on peril of their lives, or what with them was of equal moment, the loss of the treasure now so nearly within their grasp, utter a single word, and, stationing Ruth and Mrs. Brown a little away, as an outpost, to guard against surprise, he seized the bar, and the three men fell most lustily to digging. Near by the scene of these events was a little village, and indeed the houses of Samuel Fish and Shaker Brown might be said to form its extreme suburb in the direction of the river. The moving spirit of this place was Colonel Spreeway, a drinking, gambling, roistering merchant, and on the night in question, the business of the day having been brought to a close, he sat in his store with several of his boon companions to a late hour, and they made themselves merry with story-telling and brandy and sugar. At length some one of the company said, "What can have brought Joe Schmidt here? I saw him pass by my shop today." "Yes, and he stopped at Fish's," said another. "My wife was by there after dark," remarked a third, "and saw Shaker Brown through the window, and another man. I'll wager it was Joe." "That puts me in mind," said the colonel, "that I saw three men going across the fields towards the river, as I was coming home tonight over the bridges. One of them I knew it was Brown, for he cannot be easily mistaken, but it was so dark that I could not make out the others." "Some new money-digging humbug, I'll warrant," said another. "And if so," continued the colonel, "they are at it now. And I move, boys. We have a little sport. Come, I'll lock up, and we'll take a turn down by the bridge." This proposition met with universal favor, and the company, to the number of half a dozen, set forth, and soon arrived in the neighborhood of the river. Dividing off into little scouting parties, it was not long before the money-diggers were discovered, who, by this time, by dint of sweat and vigorous blows, had succeeded in excavating a hole of considerable size in the loose, gravelly earth. Having maintained a scrupulous silence and cut through the matted roots of the beech with a chisel, they had got on with little noise and the more speed, until the shoulders of tall Shaker Brown, as he slowly erected himself in discharging his shovel's burden, hardly exceeded in altitude the level of the turf. Carefully approaching close enough to ascertain the position of affairs, which they succeeded in doing without disturbing the sentinels of the night, Ruth and Mrs. Brown, who, like two deserted river nymphs, stood alone at a little distance from their friends, but eyes and soul absorbed in what was going on in the pit. The colonel and his followers reassembled near the bridge. There was a large bright moon, but an occasional cloud passed over it, and selecting a moment when it was obscured, they betook themselves to the bridge, and presently the diggers were interrupted by a noise, as of 1,000 cattle upon it. Mrs. Brown screamed and fled toward the pit, but Ruth, with masculine courage, stood her ground. Joe Schmidt dropped his shovel and cautiously peered around, and then motioned Shaker Brown to help himself out upon the level earth to reconnoiter. This the old gentleman did with some difficulty, but by the time he came in sight of the bridge, all was still. The moon was shining brightly again. The bridge was bare and cold, and not a living thing to be seen in any direction. After waiting a little time, he returned and expressed to his companions, by mute looks and gestures, his inability to explain the strange occurrence. And so, after wondering in silence a minute or two, the trio proceeded in their labor. Soon, however, they were startled and alarmed by a most vigorous caterwauling, set up on all sides of them and in their immediate neighborhood, and screams and screeches as of a score of panthers succeeded, and every variety of noise which mortal organs may be supposed capable of producing. The sounds were enough to curdle one's blood in his veins. The women shrieked, and the men, not excepting the king conjurer, Joe, turned pale. And now, to add to their affright, amidst the din, were seen strange beings on all fours, leaping like frogs from bush to bush, and turning with threatening, and to the excited imaginations of the money-diggers, hellish aspect toward the pit. It was too much for human strength to bear. Joe Schmidt, Samuel Fish, and Shaker Brown, bold men though they were, as they subsequently proved themselves when matched with flesh and blood, clambered upon terra firma as best they might, and taking their women between them, broke from the magical spot, beset, as they believed it, with a host of devils from the infernal regions, and fled toward home. Up to this time, it is probable that Schmidt, although well aware he was deceiving others, was not deceived himself, but now he appears to have been caught in one of his own snares. Unable to account for the singular interruptions they had experienced, he came to the sage conclusion that, in the practice of his conjurations, he had indeed called up the spirits of the invisible world, and spirits, it would seem, that it might be no very easy matter to quell. Colonel Spreeway and his friends, as soon as the coast was clear, gathered around the pit and enjoyed a hearty laugh. There lay the shovels and bars and picks, as they had been dropped, and the alarm which seized upon those who had them in use, and the lights by which they had worked were left burning. Dispatching one of his fellows in pursuit of the diggers, to make sure against a surprise in return, the colonel sent another to his store after an old box and some nails. These presently arrived, when the box was filled with stones, nailed down and lowered into the pit, and the party now in possession commenced digging in turn. They sunk a hole some 2 or 3 feet below the depth previously attained, and placing the box thereon, piled stones upon it, and finished by smoothing the surface as nearly as possible to the shape in which they found it. This done, they retired to their several homes. The money-diggers, meanwhile, were brooding over the discomfiture at Shaker Brown's. Their appearance was draggled and woe-begone in the extreme, and to add to their despondency, Joe had made the astounding disclosure that he'd felt the box of gold once that night with his shovel, just as Mrs. Brown screamed, when it moved away from his touch, grating as it went, and very likely had gone to the other side of the tree, if not farther. This mad effect of the unfortunate scream made Mrs. Brown, for the time being, a sort of scapegoat, on which the rest were disposed to lay not only their sins, but their misfortunes, and occasioned her being regarded with sinister looks, even by her doting husband. And Ruth, not content with this, in that spirit of charity which one woman occasionally delights to exhibit to another, added a variety of taunting expressions, so that the pale, but round-faced and handsome Mrs. Brown kept aloof in a corner and pouted by herself. By and by, Schmidt and Samuel gathered composure and courage enough to revisit the scene of their unaccountable adventures. They found everything quiet, and to appearances as they had left it, except that the candles had burned low. These they extinguished, and piling some loose brushwood over the pit to conceal it as much as possible from chance of observation, they finally adjourned for the night. The day following was devoted by the male part of the money diggers to rest. Samuel slept, but Ruth, as usual, was astir. Her faith in the truth of her dream was by no means shaken. On the contrary, it seemed to have gathered strength from the very obstacles which had presented themselves in the way of its fulfillment. In fact, she was in a sort of bewilderment. Visions of wealth and the pleasures attendant thereon floated through her brain, and as she dismissed her husband's customers from the door, she could not well refrain from assuming some unaccustomed airs, and treating them with an indifference very foreign from her usual affable deportment. Some she informed that her husband was sick and could not be disturbed; others that he had given up his shop and they must go elsewhere; and others still that he was about to move away to the city and establish a wholesale boot and shoe store. No wonder those who listened came to the conclusion that the poor woman was demented. At Shaker Brown's the scene was somewhat similar. Mrs. Brown was rather frail, and found herself flurried from her last night's exertions. Her head was bound round with a white handkerchief, for she had the toothache, and she would gladly have obtained some rest, but as often as she lay down, or threw herself back in her rocking chair on her pillows, with her feet upon a stool and her teapot on a stand at her elbow, she was sure to be interrupted by someone's calling to examine the little articles of wooden ware which her husband was in the habit of manufacturing. Indeed, Joe Schmidt was the only one of the number whom worldly matters that day had no power to disturb. He, the shrewdest of conjurers, having eaten his fill, stretched himself at his length in Mrs. Brown's best bed, and snored like a prince at his leisure. Night having again arrived, and the moon and stars taken their places aloft, the party, as before, with the exception that Mrs. Brown was left behind like so many sheep thieves, stole in a circuit round the hills to the river, and after an anxious survey of the placid water and the still shore and upland, resumed their labor in the pit. Joe was evidently ill at ease. There was an air of perplexity and doubt upon his countenance, and as he was the central luminary, to whom the others looked for light, it is not to be wondered at that every movement betrayed uncertainty and apprehension. The shovels were operated by spiritless wills, and an hour or more wore away before they reached the stones, or any evidences of the handiwork of Colonel Spreeway and his friends. Then, indeed, there was an increased movement among them, and when finally the box itself was laid bare, the haggard, clutching joy of the money diggers was beyond bounds, and the greater as pictured on their faces that they dared not give it tongue. No word was uttered, no, not even by Ruth, who stood staring at the top of the pit, like one transfixed and dumb. With much difficulty, for it was found very heavy, the mysterious chest was raised to the surface and placed upon the ground. Then, while the hands of the silent operators trembled as with the palsy, it was attached to 2 poles by a rope, and Ruth readily lending her aid, it was slowly raised between the 4, and borne in toilsome triumph toward the village. Going by the fields to avoid observation, they were about to descend a little hill, which had cost them some trouble to climb, when they were suddenly brought to a stand by a company of men, whose faces were muffled in handkerchiefs, and a furious assault commenced upon them. But the money diggers were in no mood to be trifled with. Forming a hollow square round their treasure, they gave back taunt for taunt, and buffet for buffet, and grappled with their foes as for life or for death. The exact order of the battle, however, was soon broken, for Ruth, with a quick instinct, perceiving it was likely to go hard with her friends, threw herself upon the box and grasped it in her arms, and soon thereafter All its brave defenders were down and lying prostrate upon the turf. While they were there held, each by a strength superior to his own, one of the assailants undertook to disengage Ruth from her hold. This he found no easy task, and losing his own footing in the struggle, Cavalier and Box, and the courageous spouse of Samuel Fish, together rolled down to the bottom of the hill. The reader will readily come to the conclusion that the attacking party were no other than Colonel Spreeway and his friends, who had taken this rough method of closing up the trickery commenced by them the night before. In fact, Ruth's antagonist was no other than the gallant colonel himself. At the foot of the hill, the two combatants gained their legs at the same moment, and disdaining all parley, or maneuvering as unworthy of the occasion, Ruth rather flew than ran upon her foe. The black muffler which concealed his features vanished in a moment, and then it was that furrows, long and deep, which time and his ravages had as yet spared him, were ploughed upon his face in a twinkling. To save himself he was obliged to throw her upon the ground, and there hold her. While the colonel was engaged in this awkward passage of arms, others of his party came up, and seizing the mysterious box, quickly bore it away. Giving them a little time to secure their retreat, he then shook himself clear of Ruth, and those who had the rest of the vanquished party in charge, on the top of the hill, doing the same, they all took to their heels and disappeared. But they did not go without carrying with them substantial evidences of the fray. Beside the colonel's smeared and smarting visage, one of his followers had received a cut in the throat, which threatened him with a lockjaw for a month, and another, whose fortune it had been to join in mortal strife with Samuel Fish, received a wound from an awl, or some similar instrument of war, in the region below the back, which compelled him for a time to dispense with the luxury of a chair. Left to themselves, the money-diggers gathered together and sent up toward the sky a most woeful howl of despair. Slowly they turned toward home, crying as they went, and making the desolate night more desolate with their moans. As they came near the village, the noise they made alarmed their neighbors, and soon, although at a very unusual hour, a half-dressed company collected together to listen to the incoherent accounts they gave of the treasures which they fancied had been even in their very hands, and cruelly wrested from them in their poverty, and turned to the sustenance and enjoyment of others. By daylight, Joe Schmidt and Shaker Brown had become comparatively collected, and talked loudly of the law, but by this time the other side of the story got wind. Soon thereafter, Joe quietly decamped, but no explanations then or afterward were found to have any effect upon Samuel and his wife, or indeed upon Shaker Brown. They all believed most firmly, to the day of their deaths, that they had been robbed of countless treasures, and although they came to the conclusion that Colonel Spreeway had a hand in the robbery, they entirely discarded that portion of the current belief which referred to his agency, the depositing of the mysterious box where they had found it. In short, their imaginary losses and disappointments so preyed upon their minds as to unfit them for the business of life. They became dispirited, indeed broken-hearted, and ere many years rolled away, Samuel and Ruth, their children having scattered over the world a thriftless, uncombed set, and Shaker Brown and his wife dragged out, and at length finished, a miserable existence at the public charges. Binghamton, New York, June, 1843. Faction is a combination of a few to oppress the liberties of the many. The love of freedom is the impulse of an enlightened and presiding spirit, ever intent upon the welfare of the community or body to which it belongs, and ready to give the alarm when it beholds an unlawful conspiracy formed, whether it be of rulers or subjects, with a design to oppress it. End of Section 5. Read by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida.
Section 6 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 17. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 17, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 6, The Birth of Aurora, by Chas M. Mee. Aurora peeps forth from the gold-painted sky, on nature's sweet bosom unveiled to the eye, stealing over the east with her rich rosy light, as she turns on their hinges the portals of night. Concealment no longer her blushes can hide, as they crimson her face like a new-risen bride, gilding temple and tower, each woodland and brake, the ocean's blue wave and the slumbering lake, till the earth is awakened from slumbers so deep, and freshens in beauty while springing from sleep. Her eyes look to heaven, her hands point to earth, and flowers burst forth in their joyous birth, enchanting the eye with the forms they assume, and filling the globe with their grateful perfume. Her smile is on all, and her sweet fragrant breath refreshingly plays o'er the pillow of death, gives strength to the babe as she floats round its bed, and plays mid the curls of its innocent head. Then roaming afar till her presence doth fill with tones of rejoicing each valley and rill, daylight has broken, the sun mounts the sky, and illumines our sphere as he rises on high, smiling bright on Aurora's now fast-fading face, as she gently recedes through the regions of space, strewing blossoms and buds on the dear cherished land she loves so to visit with unsparing hand, till oppressed by the heat of old Sol's burning ray, she is lost to our view in the brightness of day. End of section 6. Recording by Alan Mapstone.
Section 7 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 17. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Faithann Gibson. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 17. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 7. Story of an Heiress. I would I were absolute Queen of Britain for the space of 1 calendar month. No treason to her gracious majesty, whose loyal subject I am. The sole and single act of my, or to speak legally, our queenship, should be to abolish, disperse, and utterly annihilate all fashionable boarding schools, to send the French governesses home to their millinery, the English ones to asylums, to be supported by the voluntary contributions of all British subjects, who desire with heads and hearts, the pupils home to their respective mammas. But what mammas? Fashionable fine lady mammas. Hey-ho, our right royal scheme is impracticable. Even an absolute queen is like the cat-y adage, and must be fain to let I cannot wait upon I would. But wherefore and whence my antipathy to these soi-disant mental miseries of Britain's wives and mothers? Because I was trained in their ways, and governed by their laws until my 18th year, and because they sent me forth frivolous and thoughtless, unskilled to find the path to happiness, although I had from nature beauty, some talent, and quick strong feelings, from fortune, rank, riches, and fashion, doubtful gifts, which embitter woes as often as they heighten bliss. The events which rendered me an heiress were fraught with shame and sorrow. When I was but a helpless, wailing baby, my mother fled her home and child, and was divorced. My only brother, then a wild but high-spirited youth, shocked at his mother's disgrace, and disgusted with the unhappiness of home, absconded, and put to sea in a merchant vessel trading to the Mediterranean. The vessel perished, and the crew was never more heard of. My father, whose sole heiress I now was, loved me little, and placed me, when only 5 years old, at a boarding school of the highest fashion. Soon after, dying, he directed that I should remain at school until the completion of my 18th year, at which early age I was to be emancipated from the control of guardians and teachers, and to enter on the unrestrained possession of my princely inheritance. Here was a perilous destiny. it might have been a high and happy one, had I received that mental, moral, and religious culture due to every rational being, but in especial to those whose wealth and station confer on them extensive social influence. And in what pursuits were spent those precious years that should have molded my character to stability and dignity? Exclusively in learning to sing, to dance, to play, to talk, and to dress fashionably. I, who was entrusted with the distribution of so large a portion of the nation's wealth, scarcely knew the names or nature of patriotism, of beneficence, of social duty, or moral responsibility. I, who had nothing to do with life but to enjoy it, was unconsciously an exile from the land of thought, a stranger to the hallowing influence of study. My pleasures were all of this noisy world, all drawn from external things. I had no inly springing source of joy, no treasures stored to solace the hidden life. Oh, happy are the children whose infancy reposes on a mother's bosom, whose childhood laughs around her knees and gazes upward into her loving eyes. Home is the garden where the young affections are reared and fostered, till they rise gradually and grandly into the stateliest passions of the human soul. But I was even an alien from the domestic hearth. The flow of gentle feeling in me lay motionless and chill, still as a frozen torrent, yet destined to leap to rushing and impetuous life under the first dissolving rays of passion. But these are the reflections of an altered character, and a maturer age. Not such were the feelings with which the young and high-born Augusta Howard entered on the career of fashionable life. I was now 18, and I resolved to avail myself abundantly of my legal liberty. I took a splendid residence in town, purchased the companionship of a tarnished widow, and delightedly resigned myself to the intoxication of the triumphs that awaited my entrance on the gay world. I trod the spacious apartments of my mansion with a transported and exultant sense of freedom and independence. I danced along, the mistress of its brilliant revels. Song and light and odor floated around my steps, and my free heart bounded gaily to the beat of martial music. Life seemed a feast, a gorgeous banquet. I, an exempted creature whom no sorrow nor vicissitude could reach. The young and brave, the affluent and noble, strove for my favor as for honor and happiness. Every eye offered homage, every lip was eager to utter praise. Ah, it is something to walk the earth arrayed in beauty, clad in raiment of nature's own glorious form and dye. And what though it be not fadeless? What though the disrobing hands of death must cast it off to darkness and the worm? Is it not something to have been a portion of the spirit of delight, a dispenser of so many of the stray joys that lie scattered about the highways of the world? Surely loveliness is something more than a mere toy, when but to look on it ennobles the gazer, and raises him nearer to truth and heaven. For me, although in the first giddy years of youth I knew not how to prize aright any gift of nature, I yet felt that the joy of being beautiful springs from a warmer and purer source than vanity. Still I prized too highly the potency of personal attractions, when I believed them absolute over the affections. I lived to learn that there are hearts which it cannot purchase. Meanwhile the gloss of novelty grew dim, my keen zest for pleasure began to pall, and the monotony of dissipation grew distasteful to me. The flowery opening of the world's path had been bright and gay, but now it was no longer new, and I began to inquire whither it would lead. I was hourly assailed by the importunities of my noble suitors, but I was in no haste to abridge the triumphal reign of vanity. I was a stranger to the only sentiment that could render marriage attractive to one situated as I was, and I consequently regarded it as an event that would diminish my power and independence. I had, too, considerable acuteness, and I believed that many of my most ardent admirers would have been less impassioned had my dowry been less munificent. In this class I was secretly disposed to rank Lord E., the handsomest and most assiduous of the competitors for my heart, hand, and estates. I was quite indifferent to him, and his pleadings gratified no better feelings than vanity. But my coldness seemed only to heighten his ardor, and he had the art of making the world believe that he ranked high in my regard. By his pertinacity and the tyranny of etiquette, I found myself his almost constant partner in the dance, and he neglected no opportunity of exhibiting the deportment of a favored lover. Reports were constantly circulated of our engagement and approaching union, yet I did not dismiss him from my train. I contented myself with denying any positive encouragement to his pretensions, because, though I did not love him, his society pleased me as well as that of anyone else, and I sometimes thought that, should I marry, he deserved reward as much as another. True, there were some young and generous hearts among my suitors, who might perhaps have loved me disinterestedly, who were captivated by the charms of my gaiety, youth, and fresh enjoyment of life. But love cannot always excite love, even in an unoccupied heart, and mine was alike indifferent to all, so that I was in danger of forming the most important decision of my life from motives that ought not to influence the choice of a companion for an hour. But fate, or rather Providence, had reserved a painful chastening for my perverted nature. Freed as I was from the ties of kindred or affection, I had no friends through whom death might afflict me, and pecuniary distress could not touch one so high in fortune's favour. There was but one entrance through which moral suffering could pass into my soul, and that entrance is soon found. Nothing seemed so unlikely as that I should ever nourish an unhappy affection, or know the misery of loving unloved again. Yet even such was the severe discipline destined to exalt and purify my character. I was in the habit of attending the parish church of the fashionable neighbourhood in which I resided. I went partly from an idea that it was decorous to do so, but chiefly from custom, and the same craving after crowded assemblies which would have sent me to an auction or a rout. Neither to service or sermon did I ever lend the smallest attention. It was not that I was an unbeliever. No, I neither believed nor doubted, for I never reflected on the matter at all. This infidelity of levity is 1,000-fold more demoralizing than the infidelity of misdirected study. Wherever thought is, there is also some goodness, some hope of access to truth. But folly, the cold, the impassive, is well nigh irreclaimable. Our courtly preachers were cautious not to disturb the slumbering consciences of their hearers, and the spirit of decorum, rather than that of piety, seemed to actuate them in the discharge of their functions. But a new preacher was sent to us. He was indeed a fervent and a true apostle. When he first entered the pulpit, directly opposite to which my pew was situated, I scarcely looked at him, but my ear was soon caught by the solemn harmony of his voice and diction, and I turned toward him my undivided attention. Ah, genius! Then first I knew thee in thy brightest form, labouring in thy holiest ministry, robed in beauty and serving truth. It seemed as though my soul had startled from a deep, dead slumber, and was listening entranced to the language of its native heaven. I experienced what the Eastern monarch vainly sought, a new pleasure. For the first time I trembled and glowed under the magic sway of a great mind. For the first time heard lofty thought flowing in music from the lips of him who had embodied and conceived it. Never shall I forget that high and holy strain. It was a noble thing to see that youthful being stand before the mighty of the land, their monitor and moral guide. They, old in years and high in station, the rulers and lawgivers of a great nation. He, devoid of worldly honours and unendowed, save by the energy of his virtuous soul and God-given genius. What moral power was his! What a blessed sphere of usefulness! It was his to wile the wanderer back to virtue by the charms of his eloquent devoutness, to startle the thoughtless by the terrors and the glories of the life to come, to disturb with the awful forethought of death the souls of men who were at peace in their possessions, and lift to immortality the low desires of those who had their hearts and treasures here. Nerved by a sublime sense of the sacredness of his mission, he did not spare to smite at sin, lest it should be found sitting in the high places, but his divinely gentle nature taught him that we have all of us one human heart, and that the unerring way to it lies through the generous and tender feelings. Charity and entire affection for his whole human family were the very essence of his moral being, and the saintly fervour of his philanthropy shed a corresponding, though far fainter glow, into the bosoms of his hearers. It is not too much to say that none ever listened to him without becoming, for the time at least, a nobler and more rational creature. And to exert weakly so sacred and benign a power as this, was it not to be a good and faithful server of humanity? For me, virtue and intellect were at once unveiled before me, and they did not pass unhomaged. I imbibed delightedly the grand and exalting sentiments of Christian morality. I had not indeed become at once religious, but, thanks to the natural blessedness and innocence of morning life, I wished to become so, and this is much, for it is the desire of wisdom that bringeth to the everlasting kingdom. I left church, my imagination full of the young divine. I longed much to meet him in society, and find whether his manners and conversation would dissolve the spell which his genius had cast upon me. My wish was soon gratified, for his society was much courted, and never among the pretenders to exclusive grace and fashion did I meet a person of such captivating demeanour and endearing modesty, of mental superiority so charmingly veiled as Stephen Trevor. Long after our first acquaintance, I expressed my hearty admiration of him with the frankness natural to my disposition. I could perceive that my doing so arrayed against him the envious jealousy of my admirers, and especial of Lord E. They needed not to fear, so long as I could speak of him so unreservedly. The dignity of Trevor's character inspired me with such profound awe that I could never summon courage to offer him a single compliment. But my bearing toward him was more courteous and respectful than it had ever been to any other man of his years. He, however, had little in common with the circle of which I formed a part. He was sometimes among, but never of us. His selected friends and companions were of a different stamp, and my acquaintance with him was consequently limited to brief and occasional interchanges of conventional courtesy. He knew little of me, but I had perused and reperused his lovely character, and learned from the perusal how to solve the sage's debated question of what is virtue. The Sabbath was now my day of rest and peace and joy. I looked forward to it with the rapture of a child who anticipates a holiday. But it was not the Creator whom I thus joyed to worship. It was before his glorious creature that I bent in almost prostrate idolatry. Yes, the flattered, adored, and haughty Heiress, she who had trifled with human hearts as with the baubles of an hour, was now pouring out her first affections and unregarded tribute, won by him who alone had never wooed her favor, to whom her boasted beauty and her boundless wealth were valueless as dust and ashes, and in whose regard the lowliest and homeliest Christian maiden was of more esteem than she. Yes, imagination, passion, sensibility, long dormant, now awoke. To what a world of suffering! But if suffering, it was also life, life whose sharpest pangs were worthy and ennobling. Why should I blush to own, and shrink from describing, the heavenliest feeling of my nature? Why not glory that my spirit turned coldly away from the frivolous and the base, and bowed in reverent homage at the shrine of worth, and wisdom, and holiness, and genius? Yes, it was through my admiration of these great qualities that love won its unimpeded way into the far recesses of my soul. Blessed be nature that gave me strong sympathies, able to struggle up through the trammels of a false and feeble education. Blessed be love, ay, even its very thorns, for by it I was first led into the sweet and quiet joys of literature, and felt the infinitely growing joys of knowledge, and learned to gaze delightedly upon the changing and immortal face of nature. At first I had not thought Trevor beautiful. This I remember distinctly, or I could not now believe it. For so soon as I had marked the mystic intelligence between the outward aspect and the inward heart, his face became to me even as the face of an angel. His soft dark hair flowed meekly away on either side of forehead where mental power and moral grandeur sat fitly throned. His eyes shone serenely lustrous with the soul's own holy light, and the warm benevolence of his bright smile. While he preached, the light from a richly stained oriel window streamed upon his figure, at times shrouding him in such a haze of crimson or golden splendor that he seemed a heaven-sent seraph circled by a visible glory. There was no sorrowful or paining thought blended with the glad beginnings of my love. Earth and sky seemed brighter than before, human faces wore happier smiles, and all living things were girdled by my widening tenderness. I sought out dear poesy, and learnt her sweet low hymns, and chanted them softly to my own glad heart. I held high commune with the mighty of old, the men of renown, for what but genius can be the interpreter of passion? The world-weariness had passed away. I descried from afar the transient abode of happiness, and I resigned myself to the current of events, which I hoped would drift me toward it. I knew not of the gulf that yawned between. There was not perhaps one of my acquaintance who would not have regarded as a debasement my alliance with a poor curate such as Trevor, and I was as yet so far tainted with their false notions as to interpret his slowness in seeking my intimacy into the timidity of a humble adorer. Often, as I caught his eye fixed steadily upon me, I translated his pitying or reproving silentness into the language of admiration, to which I was so much better accustomed. I had not yet attained to true lover's perfect humbleness. I knew not that Trevor's unworldliness would reckon a virtue of more account than an estate in a wife's dowry, or that he would never think of finding his life's friend in such a giddy, fluttering child of folly as I appeared to be, as, but for my love of him, I would have been. But I was soon to know the passion's pain and power, the wasting restlessness of doubt and fear. I soon grew peevish and impatient-hearted, as I marked the many occasions of seeking my society, which he let pass unheeded. I grew weary of crowded assemblies, where I in vain watched for his face, and listened for his voice. And when he did come, and when he greeted me with his placid and gracious smile, I felt the sick chill of hopelessness steal over me. as I contrasted his mild indifference with the passionate worship of my own shut and silent heart. Sometimes I fancied that he was wrapped too high in heavenly contemplation to dream of earthly love. His enthusiasm, too, glowing as it was so holy, so calm. But is not enthusiasm ever calm and always holy? And does not true insight into the life of things convince us that the loftiest and purest intellects are ever twin-born with the warmest hearts? That tenderness and genius are seldom or never divorced? When I witnessed Trevor's fervent piety and heard his touching eloquence, I felt that they both sprang from the pure depths of an affectionate heart. I knew that he would love loftily, holily, and forever, but I feared, alas, alas, that I could never be the blessed object of his love. I had found the only human being who could call forth the latent energies and affections of my soul, but his eye was averted, and I had no space in his thought. I knew the firm and steady character on which my weak and turbulent nature could have cast itself so fondly for support, but it had no sympathy with mine. I saw the haven in which my heart would fain have set up its everlasting rest, but it rejected me. Sometimes the thought would arise that could he know of my devotional attachment, he would not fail to yield a rich return. But could the raising of an eyelash have gained his love at the risk of revealing my own, the revealment would not have been made. I would have rejected his regard if it sprang from such a source. This was not pride, nor prejudice, nor education. It is the very soul and centre of a woman's being. I was conscious that my face was but too apt to betray my thought, and I was terrified lest anyone should detect my preference for Trevor. Lord E. alone suspected it. His jealous eyes were forever riveted upon my countenance, and he alone read aright my wandering, vacant eye and changing cheek. His shrewdness had long been aware of the impassioned temperament that lurked beneath my sportive manners, and he believed me very capable of lavishing my fortune and affections upon one of nature's noblemen, a prodigality which he was determined, if possible, to prevent. He did not dare openly to slander the high character of Trevor, but he had recourse to the sneers and petty brands which calumny do use, in hopes of depreciating him in my estimation. When he saw with what ineffable scorn I smiled upon such attempts, he artfully insinuated that my partiality was known, and he believed to be generally discouraged by Trevor himself, but at the same time professed his own disbelief of anything so preposterous and in every way so derogatory to me. This was entirely false, and I thought it so, but the bare imagination of such an indignity caused me to treat Trevor with a haughty coldness well calculated to convict me of impertinent caprice. These, however, were only the feelings that predominated when I was in society. They partook of its pettiness and turbulence. But in solitude, and in the hour of prayer, I felt my undeservings, and knew how immeasurably high Trevor ranked above me. One Sunday Trevor was absent from church, and his place was filled by a dull and drowsy preacher. My imagination framed 1,000 reasons for so unusual an absence. He might be removed to another charge, gone without a word of parting or preparation, or he might be ill and dying. My worst conjecture had scarcely erred. Pestilence had caught him in his merciful visits to the dwellings of disease and want, and he lay in imminent danger of death. Oh, what I would not then have given for a right to tend him! Never, in his proud and happy days, did I so passionately wish to be his sister, his betrothed, his wife, or anything that could be virtuously his. Had I been empress of the world, I would have bartered my crown and sceptre for the tearful and unquiet happiness of watching by his sick couch. I envied even the hireling nurses who should smooth his pillow and read his asking eye and guard his feverish slumber. Poets have celebrated woman's heroism in braving plague or pestilence for those she loves, but it asks none. To do so is but to use a dear and enviable privilege. Heroism and fortitude are for her who loves, yet dares not approach to share or lessen the danger of the loved. Accustomed as I was to conceal my feelings, it was yet a hard task to mask my anguish from eyes quickened by jealousy and suspicion. I dared not absent myself from the haunts of dissipation, lest it should be said that I cared more for the danger of a good man than the heartless idlers whose ridicule I dreaded. I rose from a pillow deluged with salt tears, and bound my aching temples with red rose wreaths. I danced when I would fain have knelt to heaven in frantic supplications for that precious life. I laughed with my lips when the natural language of my heart would have been moans, sorrowful and many. Every day I, like any other slight acquaintance, sent a servant to make complimentary inquiries concerning Trevor's health. One day, in answer to my message, my servant brought me intelligence that the crisis of the fever had arrived, and that his fate would that night be decided. It was added, too, that the physicians feared the worst. That evening I found it impossible to continue the struggle between the careless seeming and the breaking heart. I shut myself into my own apartment, and gave free course to sorrow. I fled to prayer, and with incoherent and passionate beseechings implored that the just man might live, even though I were never more to see him. I read over the church service, as I read, recalling every intonation of that venerated voice, now spent in the ravings of delirium, perhaps soon to be hushed in death. I searched out the texts of Scripture on which he used to dwell, and while I pondered on the awful event which the night might bring forth, a sudden impulse of superstition seized me. I resolved to seek from the sacred book an omen of the morrow's issue, and opening it at hazard, determined to regard the first verse that should present itself as the oracle of destiny. The words that met my eyes were appallingly appropriate. He pleased God and was beloved, and living among sinners he was translated. He was taken away, lest wickedness should alter his understanding, or deceit beguile his soul. Being made perfect in a short space, he fulfilled a long time. These awful words smote me like the fiat of doom. A wild, sad yearning to look even upon the walls that enclosed him seized me, and with some difficulty, eluding the observation of my domestics, I walked toward Trevor's house unattended and unsheltered. Through darkness and driving rain, streets over which I had often been borne in triumph and in joy, I now trod on foot, in tears and alone, the pilgrim of grief and love. I reached Trevor's house, and stood on the threshold he so often crossed on his angel errands of goodwill to man, and which he might never more pass but as a journeyer to the grave. Oh, for one last look of his living, breathing form! And there had been times and hours, now fled for ever, when I might have touched his hand, met his eye, and won his kindly smile, and I had swept past him with a haughty seeming and hypocritical coldness which were nothing to him then or now, but they were much to my remorseful memory. Convulsive throbbing shook my frame, and I had raised the knocker in the purpose of inquiring whether he still lived, when the ever-haunting fear of detection restrained me. I passed to the other side, from which I could see the closely curtained windows of the patient's chamber, and could discern, by the faint light within, the gliding forms of his attendants. Long I paced the dark and silent street, gazing upon the walls that held all that I prized on earth, pouring out my heart like water unto one who, in leaving the world, would cast back no regretful thought on me, one on whom the ponderous tomb might shortly close, and shut me out into the void and dreary world, with my unregarded love and my unpitied weeping. But morning brought unhoped joy. Trevor lived, would live. My prayer had ascended. After his recovery, he visited all his acquaintance, and me among the rest. I now met him for the first time, freed from the prying observation of others, and this, together with the joy of seeing him after so painful an absence, imparted a cordiality to my manner, which seemed to fill him with a pleased surprise. But much as I desired to please him, I found it impossible to make any effort toward doing so. My powers of conversation were utterly paralyzed, and though he stayed a considerable time, I feared he must think me a most vapid and unintelligent being. Hitherto I had not seen Trevor pay marked attention to any woman, but one evening he came to a concert, accompanied by a matron and a young lady, both strangers to me, the latter a fair and interesting, but not strikingly beautiful girl. Trevor and she seemed to be on intimate and even affectionate terms. I learned her name. It was not his. She was not his sister. I began to know the tortures of jealousy. Next evening I was at a ball. Trevor was not there. We were dancing the quadrille of La Pastorelle, and I was standing alone, at that part where the lady's own and opposite partners advanced to meet her, when I heard a lady near me say to another, "So, Mr. Trevor and Miss are to be married immediately." This knell of my happiness rung out amid the sounds of music and laughter. The dancers opposite, struck with the blanched and spectral hue of my complexion, cried out at once, "What is the matter? Miss Howard, you are ill?" But with a strong, proud effort, I replied that I was perfectly well, danced through my part, and then stood beside Lord E., who was as usual my partner. The ladies were still engaged in the same conversation. "He goes to Devonshire next week, for change of air after his long illness. He is to remain some time on a visit at her father's house. I understand it is a long engagement." Lord E. heard these words, and guessed at once the cause of my sudden pallor. I saw that he did, and resolved to defy his penetration. Never had I been so wildly gay, never excited so much admiration as on that miserable evening. The recklessness of despair bewildered me, and in a sort of mad conspiracy with fate against my own happiness, I gave my irrevocable promise to be the wife of Lord E., A double bar was thus placed between me and the most perfect of God's creatures. He had selected one, doubtless worthy of him, with whom to tread virtue's ways of pleasantness and paths of peace, while I, linked in a dull bond with one whom I neither loved nor hated, must pursue the weary round of an existence without aim or duty or affection. I was but 19, and happiness was over. Hope, the life of life, was dead, and the future, imagination's wide domain, nothing but one dim and desolate expanse. Lord E. made the most ostentatious preparations for our approaching union, which he took care should be publicly known, so that I was congratulated upon it by my acquaintance, and among the rest by Trevor himself. But the more I reflected, the more I loathed the thought of marrying Lord E. He could not be blind to my reluctance, but his avarice and vanity were both interested in the fulfillment of my promise. To a man who had desired my love, my unwillingness to fulfill the contract would have been a sufficient cause for dissolving it. But Lord E. had wooed my wealth, and I had promised it to him. How then could I retract? Gladly indeed would I have given half my fortune in ransom of my rash pledge, but such a barter was impossible, and I saw no means of escaping the toils which my own folly had woven around me. One day, while I was revolving these bitter thoughts and awaiting the infliction of a visit from Lord E., a letter in a strange hand was delivered to me. It ran thus: My dear Augusta, did you ever hear of a wild youth, your brother, who was supposed to have been lost at sea when you were a baby? I am that brother. I fear I dare no longer say that youth. I have passed through as many adventures as would rig out 10 modern novels, but which would be out of place in this little brotherly epistle. At last, however, I was seized with a strange fit of homesickness, and coming to England to recover, I find my pretty little sister a wit, a beauty, and heiress of my heritage. I understand, and you are doubtless also aware, that my father never gave up all hope of my return, and that by his will I am entitled to all his property, except a paltry portion of 10,000 pounds for you. But I have seen you, my dear girl, and I like you vastly, so that you may be sure I shall not limit your portion as my father did. I candidly confess that I doubt whether I may be able legally to prove my title, though my old nurse, who lives with you, and with whom I have had an interview, denies me easily. I shall visit you, however, and I am sure when you compare me with my father's portrait, you will acknowledge me to be your living brother, Henry Howard. I was well aware of the clause in my father's will to which the writer alluded, but it had always seemed to me and to my guardians a mere dead letter. Some time before I might have grieved at the prospect of losing my wealth. Now it filled me with joy, as affording a hope of release from Lord E. I flew to the nurse, and found her ready to swear to the stranger's identity with the lost Henry Howard. I seized my pen joyfully, and addressed to him a few hasty lines. My dear brother, if you be indeed my brother, you shall only need to prove your title to my own heart. My sense of justice, and not the mandate of the law, shall restore your inheritance to you. As to my portion, I shall accept of nothing but that which is legally mine, until I know that I shall require it, or whether I can love you well enough to be your debtor. I had scarcely dispatched this billet when Lord E. was announced. I received him with unwonted gaiety, for I was charmed to be the first from whom he should hear of my altered circumstances. I longed to take his sordid spirit by surprise, and break triumphantly and at once from his abhorred thraldom. He was delighted with my unusual affability, and was more than ever prodigal of his adorable Augustus, etc., more than ever ardent in his vows of unchangeable love. I maliciously drew him on, asking with a soft Lydia-languish air whether he could still love me, should any mischance deprive me of my fortune. Oh, what a question! He could imagine no happier lot than to live with me in a cottage upon dry bread and love, sighs and roses. I professed my satisfaction, and congratulating him on such a brilliant opportunity of proving his disinterestedness, related what had occurred. To me it was most amusing to witness, first his incredulity, then his blank dismay, and lastly his languid professions of constancy, ludicrously mingled with stammering complaints of his own embarrassed circumstances, which would prevent his obeying the dictates of affection by urging his immediate union. A short postponement would now be necessary, etc., etc. At least, raising his looks to mine, he met my mocking and derisive smile, and saw the joy that danced in my eyes. He thereupon thought proper to discover that I had never loved him, and found it convenient to be mightily indignant thereat. I nodded assent to his sapient conjecture, and, drawing my harp toward me, sang with mock pathos the first line of "For the lack of gold he's left me, oh." Though a release from our engagement was now desirable to him, he was deeply mortified at the manner of it, and making me a sulky bow, he departed, while I trilled forth in merrier measure, "O ladies, beware of a false young knight, who loves and who rides away." So ended Lord E.'s everlasting constancy. My brother's return and Lord E.'s consequent desertion were soon known to the world, and a dangerous illness with which I was at this time seized was generally ascribed to these causes. But far other were my thought. I looked back with thankfulness on my deliverance from the danger of marrying a man so worthless as Lord E. had proved, and though the means of beneficence and enjoyment were diminished, I looked forward to a more happy and useful life than I had hitherto led. I had, too, proud resolves of vanquishing my predilection for Trevor, but a passion based upon virtue is so indestructible, and the youthful heart clings with such a fond tenacity even to its defeated hopes, that I could not forego the desire of earning at least his society and friendship. I could not conceal from myself that his passionless esteem would be dearer to me than the undivided homage of 100 hearts. He had been in Devonshire during my illness, but returned before I had recovered. My supposed misfortunes were a sufficient passport to his kindness, and he who had been reserved and distant in the days of my prosperity was all assiduity in the season of sickness and reverse of fortune. Every day during my convalescence he made me a long visit, and every day augmented my delight in his society and unrivalled conversation. His visits were those of a Christian pastor, and in that paternal character he one day expressed his approbation of the cheerful fortitude with which I had sustained such trying misfortunes. I could not bear that he should think I ever loved Lord E., for I saw that it was to him he chiefly alluded, and I impetuously protested that I had ever been indifferent to him, and considered my release a blessing. This avowal seemed to establish a more intimate friendship and confidence between us, in the course of which I learned that it was Trevor's brother, a Devonshire country gentleman, and not himself, who was engaged to Miss, the lady whom I had seen with him at the concert. Trevor's visits, which had commenced in compassionate kindness toward me, were now continued for his own gratification, and before one brief and happy month had passed away, I had won the first love of his warm and holy heart, and knew myself his chosen one, his companion through time and through eternity. The long-sought was found, the long-loved was my lover. In describing the origin and progress of his regard, Trevor admitted that his former intentional avoidance of my society was the result of a prepossession which he feared to indulge, partly from a belief in the report of my engagement to Lord E., but chiefly from an opinion that my education and habits must have rendered my character uncongenial to his. I too had my confidings to make, but though I shed blissful tears upon the bosom of my dear confessor when owning my past errors and frivolity, I did not acknowledge that my affection had preceded his own, and was many months his wedded wife before he learnt to guess how long and hopelessly he had been beloved. How little do we know of each other's joys or sorrows! When, on the first Sunday after my recovery, I sat in my accustomed place in church, there was not perhaps one of my acquaintance who did not consider me an object of compassion. They did not know the bright reversal of my doom. They could not believe that I was the happiest creature who trod the earth, nor imagine the overswelling tenderness with which I listened to the eloquent preacher, and turned from him to look upon my wan and wasted hand, where sparkled the ring of our betrothment, as if to assure my throbbing heart that happiness so perfect was not a dream. Since then years have passed, many and full of blessings. The inheritance whose timely loss gained me my precious Stephen has reverted to our duteous children, who know how to use it better than did their mother in her days of thoughtlessness and pride. They exemplify the good parent's blessed power to make his children virtuous as himself, and when I see them, in turn, exerting a similar power, I remember that all that they or I possess of goodness we owe to the influence of one true Christian. I am filled with a sublime sense of the value and exalted dignity of virtue. My Stephen's hairs are white, but his heart has known no chill. He loves as fondly as ever the faded face that now, as in its day of bloom, still turns to him for guidance or approval, and I, eternity could not wear out my love for him. End of section 7.
Section 8 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 17. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 17, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 8. The Worthies of Virginia, by Mrs. Elizabeth Oakes Smith, author of Sinless, Child, etc. Take off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. Yes, verily, it is so. It is the soil consecrated by the ashes of the great and the good, the Worthies of Virginia. Well may the eye kindle and the pulse throb as we approach a theme so majestic, so full of lofty and patriotic associations. Even like the heroes of Ossian, each leaning from his cloud of mist, do we behold the noble array of patriots, orators, and statesmen sweep by us in the sternness and grandeur of other days. Virginia, a name associated with the proudest days of English chivalry, in its second baptismal with the blood of freemen. In all ages the patriot of every land shall turn his face thitherward and do homage, even as the pilgrim at the shrine of Mecca. The worthies of Virginia, let us pause ere we enter their thrice penetralia. Centuries disappear, and we behold a princely saloon in which are congregated stately dames and gallant knights, the grace and the chivalry of old England. A haughty princess, with an air of stiff courtesy, her queenly bearing, but ill disguising her woman's coquetry, is presenting a parchment to a knightly courtier who kneels to receive it. They are the queenly Elizabeth and the chivalric Raleigh, the noble, generous, accomplished, but unfortunate Raleigh. The parchment contains letters patent, granting him full power for the discovering and settling new lands and countries not actually possessed by any Christian. Under these auspices was the country now called Virginia discovered, and thus it is that Sir Walter Raleigh must be claimed as one of the early worthies of the state, as without his persevering enterprise this goodly country might have remained still longer unknown. The early discoverers give the following description of the country, which would of itself be found sufficiently inviting at the present day. The soil is most plentiful, sweet, wholesome, and fruitful of all others. There are about 14 several sorts of sweet-smelling timber trees, the most parts of the underwood, bays, and such like, such oaks as we have, but far greater and better. Years pass away with their sufferings, trials, and disappointments, and another of the worthies of Virginia appears upon the stage, a man distinguished by all the constituents of greatness, by all the attributes of a hero, intrepid, brave, generous, and persevering, daunted by no perils, dismayed by no hardships. His clear, vigorous mind penetrated the dim mist of futurity, and beheld, though as in a glass darkly, yet did he behold something of the ultimate greatness of the country for which he toiled and suffered. In perils by land, in perils by sea, in fasting and nakedness, a captive and condemned to die, he neither shrinks nor is dismayed. The same unflinching resolution impels him onward, and the same buoyancy of hope cheers him in every difficulty. John Smith, or as the chroniclers of the day invariably distinguish him, Captain John Smith, was one of the most extraordinary men of the great age in which he lived. He should be regarded as the shadowing wing of Virginia, for to his valor, skill, and judgment in counteracting the subtle policy of the great Powhatan may she be said to owe her very existence. There is still another, the beautiful personation of all that is loveliest in woman, the meek, loving child of the forest, whose history seems like a tale of romance, with its sad melancholy close, who rises like a beam of beauty upon the sight, winning the admiration and gratitude of every heart, capable of one solitary response to all that is lovely in woman and heroic in our race. That blessed Pocahontas, the great king's daughter of Virginia, to quote the admiring, if not loving, language of Captain John Smith, beams forth in those dark and perilous times, like some kindly spirit, hushing the tempest of savage passion, dispensing comfort and succor to the disheartened exile, and with her own gentle bosom warding off all the evils that threaten the infant colony of Jamestown. Blessings ever upon the kindly savage, the loveliest of the worthies of Virginia. But we will delay no longer to enter this holy of holies, the temple of American greatness, with hushed breath and reverent footsteps, even with sandals put from off our feet. Let us approach the shrine of all that is great in human glory. Washington, the great amongst the august of the earth, the son of Virginia, but she may not, she dare not engross him. His fame is the world's. It belongs to the length and breadth of the great country which he was instrumental in redeeming from oppression. His fame has gone forth wherever the stirrings of freedom have been felt, wherever liberty hath spread her glorious pinions, her word of magic, her watchword from the vale and mountain top hath been and will be forever Washington. The deep peal of human voices, like the heavings of the great ocean, resound that one name from the hoary cliffs of the Oregon, still onward to the snow-capped Andes, and the mighty Alps take up the echo from her many peaks and glittering glaciers. Let Virginia exult that the cradle and the tomb of earth's greatest belong to herself, but let her exult with awe and holiest reverence, for the wide earth shall claim him, and his cenotaph shall be erected in the heart of every freeman. Let us lay aside the prejudices of party, forget the animosities engendered by political excitement, and look upon the worthies of Virginia in their simple greatness, not as popular leaders, but far-seeing and profound statesmen, true patriots, zealous and uncompromising advocates for the rights of liberty without license, and republicanism without anarchy and misrule. Jefferson, the sage and the philosopher, he bears in his hand that noblest of all documents, not the result of inspired wisdom, the Declaration of American Independence, a document which, whether we regard it as a specimen of strong and fervid eloquence, of manly remonstrance, or of deep and solemn appeal, is every way sustained and wonderful. The writer speaks as if he felt himself to be the voice of a great and outraged people, giving indignant utterance to its many wrongs and oppressions, and in the face of heaven and the whole earth for witnesses, declaring they shall be endured no longer. Had Thomas Jefferson done nothing more than this, had he no other claims upon the admiration of the country, it were glory enough for one man. Wherever oppression has planted his foot, the indignant freeman spurns him from the soil, in the very language which the gifted Jefferson adopted for our own aggrieved and insulted country. James Madison, the accomplished scholar, the elegant expounder of the Constitution, Madison, Hamilton, and Jay, noble triumvirate, with what assiduous labor did they bend their splendid talents to the task of recommending and elucidating that Constitution prepared for their adoption, and that, too, to a people jealous of their rights, who had toiled and bled in their defense, and were ever on the alert, lest the revolution they had achieved should result only in a change of masters, a people nobly and virtuously resolved to see to it that they did not exchange the glaring usurpation of a foreign power for the equally to be dreaded tyranny of aspiring demagogues. Such a people would regard the best and wisest institutions with distrust and suspicion, and would ever appear to throw light upon the proceedings of those they had delegated to legislate for them was read with avidity. Thus was produced the Federalist, a work that will bring imperishable renown upon the great men whose patriotism and public spirit called it into existence. James Monroe, the upright and modest Republican, others may have been more brilliant, but no man ever more happily illustrated in his own practice the simple dignity and straightforward devotion to public duty, so becoming the chief magistrate of a great republic. At last, as if to affix the final seal of worthiness upon him, he was suffered to depart upon our great day of national jubilee, the day, fatal, shall we dare to say, to presidents, and ever ominous to tyrants. Patrick Henry, the schoolboy, as he reads of Demosthenes and Cicero, and feels his blood kindle at their eloquence, instinctively turns to the fervent oratory of our own gifted countrymen, and triumphantly cites the bold, daring Patrick Henry as worthy to compete with the great Grecian himself. Then, as his eye glows with enthusiasm over the splendid diction and elegant imagery of Wirt, he deems him more than equal to the Roman. Half in wonder, half in dread, he pauses over the keen, cynical Randolph, whose sarcasms were as stinging and adhesive as the nettle on the burr that annoys him in his woodland rambles. John Marshall, who shall worthily describe this most excellent amongst the worthies of Virginia, he who wore so meekly the judicial robe, the upright judge, acute, skilful, and profound, let his crowning grace be his integrity. Not a stain hath he left upon the spotless ermine. With no rash hand did he presume to touch the ark of our liberties. Woe to him who shall dare profane, even with a touch, our holiest of holies, yea, though it may shake and tremble amidst the tumults of popular excitement. But we must forbear. It was but a reverent glance that we wished to take of the few amidst the many worthies of Virginia. Let us veil our faces, for we have been with the great of the earth. Rather let us go forth from this inner temple, bearing with us a portion of their own spirit, with lips touched as with a live coal from the pure altar of freedom. Let Virginia be proud, as she well may, in view of the great men who have risen up in her midst. Let her exult in her great glory, but let her see to it that her march be still onward, that her rising sons be worthy of such fathers. Let her not be content with childish retrospection, looking backward forever upon the radiant scroll of fame, upon which is blazoned the names of so many of the great of the earth who claim her for their parent. But let her go on, pointing to those great names as an incitement to her onward career, glorying in her resplendent heritage, yet ever with an emulous ambition, resolving that of her it shall never be said, her glory is departed. For $5, sent to the publishers free of postage, 2 copies of the Rover for 1 year, or 4 copies for 6 months will be sent by mail to any part of the country. In this way, a subscriber can receive the work 6 months, making a large volume of 416 pages with 26 fine steel engravings for $1.25. The Serenade. Our plate today does much credit to the young artist who engraved it. It is indeed a beautiful thing. An illustration of the plate from the graceful muse of Lucy Hooper will be found on another page. End of section 8. End of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 17, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree.